a quiet Midwest village. Grace Carter finds an abandoned baby in the snow, protected by a loyal dog she names Buddy. Taking the child, Ethan, into her care, Grace faces suspicion and fear from the villagers. Led by Thomas Hargrove, Buddy, with his unwavering loyalty and bravery, saves Ethan multiple times, even sacrificing his life to protect him from danger. Over time, Buddy's actions transform the community, inspiring unity, compassion, and change. Ethan grows up honoring Buddy's legacy, becoming a veterinarian to help animals in need. The story of Buddy becomes a lasting symbol of love, courage, and redemption, proving that even the smallest acts of bravery can leave an everlasting impact. Did this heartwarming story of loyalty and sacrifice touch your heart? Where are you watching from? Comment below to share your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to DG Story for more inspiring tales. And hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. The wind howled through the quiet village, carrying with it the sharp sting of icy snow. It was the dead of winter in a small Midwest town during the 1970s, and everything was blanketed in a thick layer of white. Most of the villagers had retreated to their homes, seeking warmth by the fire. But that morning, something unusual disturbed the stillness. A dog's persistent barking echoed through the woods on the outskirts of the village. Edna Carter, a stern older woman, peered out her frosted window with a frown. "What in the world is going on out there?" she muttered. Her daughter, Grace Carter, a widow in her early 30s with a kind but determined face, grabbed her coat. "I'll go check," she said, ignoring her mother's protests about the cold. The sound of barking grew louder as Grace approached the edge of the woods. A group of villagers had gathered, their breaths visible in the freezing air. They stood in a loose circle, staring at something on the ground. "What's happening?" Grace asked, pushing her way through the crowd. At the center of the commotion was a large black Labrador, barking frantically. Beneath the dog, nestled in the snow, was a baby, a tiny, fragile infant wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket. Its small body trembled in the freezing cold. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered. The villagers murmured among themselves. "Who would leave a baby out here in this weather?" one man asked. "It's a bad omen," an older woman said, shaking her head. "This isn't natural." Grace knelt beside the baby, her hands trembling. The dog stopped barking and looked at her with large, pleading eyes. Grace could feel the desperation in its gaze. It wanted her to help. "We can't just leave the baby here," Grace said, looking up at the crowd. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. "Who's going to take responsibility?" someone asked. Grace stood up, cradling the baby against her chest. "I will," she said firmly. "You don't know where it came from." Another voice chimed in. "It could bring trouble to the village." Grace ignored them, focusing instead on the baby's pale face. The child's tiny fingers clutched at her coat, as if sensing safety for the first time. The Labrador followed closely as Grace began walking back toward her home. "Looks like you're coming with us, too," she said softly to the dog. Behind her, the villagers continued to whisper, their suspicions growing. But Grace didn't care. At that moment, all that mattered was saving the child. When she reached her house, her mother opened the door and gasped. "Grace, what have you done?" "I found him in the woods," Grace said, brushing past her mother and heading to the fireplace. "He needs warmth." Edna stared at the baby, her face a mix of shock and disapproval. "You don't know what you've brought into this house." Grace wrapped the baby in a blanket and gave him a bottle of warm milk. "What I brought," she said, glancing at the dog now lying protectively near the baby, "is a second chance for both of them." The dog thumped its tail against the floor, as if agreeing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village in silence once more. But inside the small home, a new story had begun, one of love, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond. The following morning, The village was buzzing with whispers. News of Grace's decision to take in the abandoned baby had spread like wildfire. Some villagers admired her kindness, but many were skeptical, even fearful. They say the dog refused to leave the baby's side. One woman said, "And now she's keeping both of them? That can't be normal." Another muttered. Grace, however, paid no attention to the gossip. Her focus was on the baby, whom she had named Ethan. His pale cheeks now had a hint of color, and his small hands clutched tightly at her fingers as she cradled him by the fire. Buddy, the Labrador, lay nearby, his watchful eyes never leaving Ethan. Every time the baby stirred or whimpered, Buddy's ears perked up, and he would shift closer, as if to reassure himself that the child was safe. Edna was far less impressed. "Grace, this isn't your responsibility," she said sharply as she stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on her hips. "What if this baby belongs to someone dangerous? What if they come looking for him?" Grace looked up from feeding Ethan. "Then they'll have to explain why they abandoned him in the woods," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "And the dog," Edna pressed. "You've led a stray into our home. What if it turns on you?" Grace glanced at Buddy, who was lying with his head on his paws, watching Ethan with a look of quiet devotion. "He saved Ethan's life. Mother, he's not going anywhere." Edna shook her head. "You're too soft-hearted for your own good, Grace." "Maybe," Grace admitted, smiling faintly, "but that's what Ethan and Buddy need right now. Someone who cares." Over the next few days, Grace began to notice just how special Buddy was. He seemed to understand Ethan's needs in a way that went beyond instinct. One afternoon, as Grace prepared lunch, Ethan started crying in his crib. Before she could react, Buddy trotted over and gently nuzzled the baby's hand with his nose. Ethan stopped crying almost immediately, his tiny fingers gripping Buddy's fur. Grace watched the scene from the kitchen doorway, her heart swelling. "You're amazing, Buddy," she whispered. Later that evening, as a storm rolled in, Grace noticed Buddy pacing near the window, his ears twitching at the sound of distant thunder. He barked once, a low, cautious sound. "What is it, boy?" Grace asked, walking over. Buddy stared into the darkness outside, his body tense. Grace followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Still, she felt a shiver run down her spine. Meanwhile, the village's unease continued to grow. At the general store, Thomas Hargrove, the town elder, spoke in hushed but firm tones. "She's inviting trouble into our community," he said, addressing a small group of villagers. "We don't know where that child came from, and that dog. There's something unnatural about it. But she's just trying to help." Margaret Anderson, kind widow, argued. "The baby was going to die if she hadn't stepped in." Thomas shook his head. "Good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. Mark my words, this will end badly." Back at her home, Grace was unaware of the growing tension in the village. She was too busy caring for Ethan and getting to know Buddy, who had quickly become her silent partner in protecting the child. One evening, as Grace rocked Ethan to sleep, there was a loud knock at the door. Buddy immediately stood, his ears perked and his tail stiff. Grace opened the door to find Thomas standing on her porch, his expression stern. "Evening, Grace," he said. "We need to talk." Grace stepped aside, letting him in. "What's this about, Thomas?" He glanced at Ethan, who was now sleeping peacefully in his crib. "You've caused quite a stir, taking in that baby and that dog," he began. "People are worried. They think you're making a mistake." Grace crossed her arms. "The only mistake would have been leaving Ethan out there to die." Thomas frowned. "I'm not saying you did the wrong thing in the moment, but have you thought about what happens next? That baby has to belong to someone. And when they come looking, I'll deal with it." Grace interrupted. "Ethan is safe here, and I'm not giving him up without a fight." Thomas sighed, shaking his head. "Just be careful, Grace. Sometimes good intentions come at a cost." As he left, Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. She looked down at Buddy, who was sitting by Ethan's crib, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Looks like it's just us against the world," she said softly. Buddy thumped his tail in agreement. The days turned into weeks, and Grace began to settle into her new role as Ethan's caretaker. Despite the cold stares and murmurs of the villagers, she poured her heart into creating a safe and loving home for the baby. Buddy had seamlessly integrated into their lives. Every morning, he followed Grace as she carried Ethan around the house, his watchful eyes never straying far from the baby. At night, he slept beside Ethan's crib, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. Grace's days became a steady rhythm of caring for Ethan. She learned how to soothe his cries, prepare his formula, and even sing lullabies to calm him at night. Though she had never been a mother before, her instincts quickly adapted. One morning, as she fed Ethan by the fire, Buddy lay nearby, chewing on an old shoe he'd found in the corner. Grace smiled at the sight. "Looks like you're settling in just fine," she said, scratching Buddy's head. Ethan cooed softly, his tiny fingers reaching out to grab Buddy's fur. The dog froze for a moment, then gently nuzzled the baby's hand. Grace's heart swelled. "You're good with him," she murmured, "almost like you were meant to be here." As Ethan grew stronger, Buddy's protective instincts became even more apparent. One afternoon, Grace left Ethan in his crib while she tended to the garden. She had just stepped outside when Buddy began barking furiously. Rushing back in, she found Buddy standing between Ethan and the open window, his teeth bared. Outside, a large hawk had perched on a tree branch, its sharp eyes trained on the baby. Grace quickly shut the window and scooped Ethan into her arms. "Good boy, Buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog wagged his tail once before returning to his spot beside the crib. His job done. Not everyone was as impressed with Buddy's devotion. Edna, still skeptical about the entire situation, often voiced her disapproval. "That dog doesn't belong in the house," she said one evening as Grace prepared dinner. "And neither does that baby, if you ask me." Grace sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Mother, I didn't ask you. Ethan is staying, and so is Buddy. They're family now." "Family?" Edna scoffed. "You don't even know where that baby came from. For all we know, he could bring trouble to our doorstep." Grace set down her spoon and turned to face her mother. "He's an innocent child, Mother, and Buddy saved his life. If you can't see that, maybe the trouble isn't them, it's you." Edna huffed and left the room, muttering under her breath. Not everyone in the village shared Edna's cynicism. Margaret Anderson, Grace's elderly neighbor, had been quietly watching from afar. One day, she came by with a basket of fresh-baked bread and preserves. "I thought you might need a little help," Margaret said, placing the basket on Grace's kitchen table. Grace smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. That's very kind of you." Margaret glanced at Ethan, who was cooing happily in Buddy's shadow. "He's a beautiful baby," she said softly. "He is," Grace agreed, her voice filled with pride. Margaret reached out to pat Buddy's head. "And this one, I've never seen a dog so devoted. You're lucky to have him." Grace nodded, her heart warming at the rare show of support. "I am. They're both blessings." One evening, as the sun set over the village, Grace sat on the porch with Ethan in her arms. Buddy lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. For the first time in weeks, the world felt peaceful. "You know," Grace said, looking down at the dog, "I never expected any of this, but I wouldn't change it for the world." Buddy thumped his tail against the wooden floor, his quiet agreement bringing a smile to Grace's face. Inside the house, Edna watched from the window, her expression softening just slightly, though she wouldn't admit it. Even she couldn't deny the bond forming between Grace, Ethan, and Buddy. The bond between Buddy and Ethan grew stronger with each passing day. It was as if the two shared an unspoken language that only they understood. Buddy's protective instincts and Ethan's innocent trust created a connection that warmed Grace's heart, even as tensions in the village persisted. One chilly afternoon, Grace decided to air out the house. She opened a window near Ethan's crib to let in fresh air while she prepared lunch in the kitchen. Suddenly, Buddy began barking furiously. Grace dropped the knife she was holding and ran to the living room. Her heart stopped when she saw a snake slithering toward Ethan's crib through the open window. "Buddy!" Grace shouted, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. Before she could act, Buddy sprang into action. He lunged at the snake, his teeth sinking into its writhing body. The snake hissed and thrashed, but Buddy held firm, dragging it away from the crib. The commotion ended as quickly as it had started. Buddy stood victorious, the lifeless snake at his feet. He let out a low growl before turning to check on Ethan, who was unharmed but crying loudly. Grace scooped Ethan into her arms, tears streaming down her face. She knelt beside Buddy, stroking his fur. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved my baby." Buddy wagged his tail once, his eyes steady and calm. The story of Buddy's heroism quickly spread throughout the village. Some people began to soften their opinions of the dog and his place in Grace's household, but others remained skeptical. One evening, Thomas Hargrove, the village elder, arrived at Grace's home. Buddy immediately positioned himself between the man and the door, his body tense and ready. "It's all right, Buddy," Grace said, placing a hand on the dog's head. "Let him in." Thomas stepped inside, his expression as stern as ever. "Grace, I've come to talk about the dog and the boy." Grace folded her arms, bracing herself for yet another argument. "What about them?" Thomas hesitated, glancing at Buddy. "The villagers are talking. They say the dog is dangerous, that it's only a matter of time before something happens." Grace's temper flared. "Something already happened. Thomas, that dog saved Ethan's life twice now. If people can't see that, maybe they're the ones who are dangerous." Thomas frowned. "You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. I'm just saying you should be careful." "Careful of what?" Grace shot back. "Caring for a baby who needs me? Trusting a dog who's done nothing but protect us?" The older man sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I hope you know what you're doing, Grace, for your sake and theirs." He left without another word, leaving Grace fuming. Buddy, sensing her distress, rested his head on her lap, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. Later that week, Edna had an unexpected moment of reflection. She watched as Grace played with Ethan in the yard, Buddy darting around them like a guardian angel. For the first time, Edna saw not chaos, but a family. That evening, as Grace prepared dinner, Edna spoke up. "You were right about one thing," she said quietly. Grace paused, turning to face her mother. "What's that?" "That dog," Edna admitted. "He's more than just a pet. He's part of the family." Grace's eyes softened. "Thank you, Mother. That means a lot." One night, as the house lay quiet, Ethan woke up crying. Grace started to rise from her bed, but before she could, Buddy was already at the crib, his soft whines calming the baby. Ethan reached out, grabbing the dog's fur, and soon drifted back to sleep. Grace stood in the doorway, her heart full. "What would we do without you, Buddy?" she whispered. The dog looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Buddy's unwavering loyalty and courage had proven time and again that he was more than just a dog. He was a protector, a companion, and a vital part of Grace and Ethan's lives. But as their bond deepened, the challenges they faced were far from over. The bond between Grace, Ethan, and Buddy was undeniable, but it also became the center of growing tension within the village. Whispers turned into accusations, and soon, Grace found herself at odds with her neighbors. One crisp morning, Grace received a message that a town meeting had been called. Reluctantly, She left Ethan and Buddy at home and made her way to the small church hall where the villagers gathered. Thomas Hargrove stood at the front, his voice booming as he addressed the crowd. "This is not about one woman and her decisions," he said, pointing toward Grace as she walked in. "This is about the safety and unity of our community." Murmurs rippled through the room. Margaret Anderson stood up, her hands trembling with anger. "Safety? That dog has done nothing but protect that baby. You're stirring up trouble where there isn't any." Thomas raised a hand to silence her. "Protecting the baby, yes, but what happens when the dog turns on someone else? Or when the real parents of that child come looking and bring trouble to our village?" Grace stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Buddy hasn't hurt anyone, and if the parents of this child cared about him, they wouldn't have left him in the snow to die." The room fell silent. For a moment, Grace thought she had gotten through to them, but then another voice piped up from the back. "She's putting us all at risk," a man said. "If she can't control that dog or keep her business to herself, maybe she should leave." Grace's face flushed with anger. "I'm not going anywhere. Ethan and Buddy are my family, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." The meeting ended without resolution, but it left the village more divided than ever. Some, like Margaret, supported Grace and admired Buddy's bravery. Others sided with Thomas, believing the situation was a danger to their way of life. The divide became evident in small ways: whispers behind Grace's back, cold stares when she walked through the village, and even a few harsh words muttered under breath. One afternoon, as Grace returned from the market, she found a note pinned to her door. It read, "Get rid of the dog, or we'll do it for you." Her hands shook as she crumpled the note. "They don't scare me," she said aloud, though she couldn't stop the chill running down her spine. Despite the growing hostility, Buddy remained vigilant. One evening, as Grace prepared dinner, Buddy began pacing near the window, his growls low and steady. "What is it, boy?" Grace asked, peering outside. In the fading light, she saw two figures standing near the edge of her property. They were gone before she could confront them, but the message was clear: someone was watching. That night, Grace slept lightly, with Buddy lying near Ethan's crib as usual. Around midnight, a loud bang startled her awake. Buddy barked furiously, rushing to the front door. Grace grabbed a flashlight and followed him. Outside, someone had overturned a stack of firewood and thrown rocks at the house. Buddy sniffed the ground, growling as he tracked the scent to the edge of the yard. "Come back, Buddy," Grace called, her voice shaking. "We'll handle this in the morning." The next day, Margaret Anderson paid Grace a visit. "I heard what happened," she said, setting down a basket of fresh bread. "People are scared, Grace, scared of change, scared of what they don't understand. They're cowards." Grace replied bitterly. Margaret nodded. "Maybe, but cowards can still be dangerous. You need to be careful." Grace looked at her, a lump forming in her throat. "I just want to protect my family, and you're doing a fine job of it," Margaret said gently. "But you don't have to do it alone." A week later, Grace was walking home from the market with Ethan in her arms and Buddy trotting beside her. They had just turned onto the main road when a man stepped out from behind a tree, blocking their path. It was Samuel Hayes, a tall, wiry man with piercing eyes. He looked at Ethan, then at Grace, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" he drawled. "Looks like you've got something of mine." Grace tightened her grip on Ethan. "I don't know who you are, but you're mistaken. This child doesn't belong to you." Samuel chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, I think he does, and I've come to take him back." Before he could get any closer, Buddy positioned himself between Samuel and Grace, his teeth bared and a growl rumbling deep in his throat. Samuel stopped, his smirk fading. "That's a dangerous dog you've got there," he said. "He's only dangerous to people who deserve it." Grace shot back. Samuel held up his hands mockingly. "All right, All right, no need to get feisty. I'll be back. And next time, I won't be alone." As he walked away, Grace's heart pounded. She looked down at Buddy, who was still growling softly, and whispered, "Good boy, you've got our backs, don't you?" Buddy wagged his tail once, but his eyes remained fixed on the path where Samuel had disappeared. The village's unease and the arrival of Samuel Hayes had brought new threats to Grace's doorstep. With Buddy's unwavering loyalty and Grace's fierce determination, they were ready to face whatever came next. But the fight for Ethan was far from over. The encounter with Samuel Hayes left Grace on edge. She couldn't shake the image of his smirking face or his veiled threats. Buddy, sensing her unease, stayed closer than ever, his watchful presence giving her a small sense of security. But deep down, Grace knew Samuel wasn't done. Days passed without incident. Grace tried to focus on Ethan, whose laughter and tiny milestones brought her joy. Buddy, ever vigilant, continued his role as protector, never straying far from Ethan's side. One sunny afternoon, Grace decided to take Ethan outside. She spread a blanket on the grass and let him crawl around under Buddy's careful watch. The baby giggled as he tugged on Buddy's ears, and the dog responded with gentle patience. "You're his best friend, aren't you?" Grace said, smiling as she watched them. Buddy wagged his tail, but his ears twitched at the sound of rustling leaves nearby. He turned his head sharply, his body tensing. "Buddy?" Grace followed his gaze but saw nothing. Buddy growled low, then positioned himself protectively in front of Ethan. Grace's heart raced. She scooped Ethan into her arms and hurried inside, Buddy following closely behind. That night, Grace was startled awake by Buddy's furious barking. She grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and rushed to Ethan's room. Buddy stood near the crib, his growls filling the dark room. "What is it, boy?" Grace whispered, her pulse quickening. A sudden noise came from the back door, a soft creak, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. Someone was trying to break in. Grace's breath caught. She grabbed Ethan from his crib and held him close. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice trembling. Buddy darted out of the room, barking ferociously. Grace followed carefully, her flashlight shaking in her hand. In the kitchen, the back door was ajar, and a shadow moved just beyond the threshold. It was Samuel. Well, he said, stepping inside. "Told you I'd be back." Before Grace could respond, Buddy lunged at Samuel, knocking him to the ground. Samuel shouted in pain as Buddy clamped his jaws onto the man's arm, refusing to let go. "Get this mutt off me," Samuel yelled, thrashing wildly. Grace's hands shook as she held Ethan tightly, her mind racing. "Get out of my house," she shouted, her voice breaking. Samuel managed to shove Buddy off and staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his arm. But before he could make another move, Buddy positioned himself between Samuel and Grace, his teeth bared and his growl deep and menacing. "You're not welcome here," Grace said, her voice steadier now. Samuel glared at her, clutching his injured arm. "You'll regret this," he spat before stumbling out the door into the night. The house was silent except for Ethan's soft whimpers and Buddy's heavy panting. Grace knelt beside the dog, her free hand stroking his fur. "You saved us again," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Buddy looked up at her, his eyes tired but full of determination. The next morning, Grace reported the incident to the sheriff. Samuel was apprehended not far from the village, his arm still bandaged from Buddy's bite. News of the attack spread quickly, and for the first time, the villagers seemed to rally around Grace. Even Thomas Hargrove, who had been one of her harshest critics, approached her with a sheepish expression. "I heard what happened," he said gruffly. "That dog of yours, he's something else." Grace nodded, her hand resting on Buddy's head. "He's more than that. He's family." Thomas hesitated before speaking again. "If you ever need anything, you let me know." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you, Thomas." That evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace sat on the porch with Ethan in her lap and Buddy at her feet. The events of the past weeks had left her exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of safety. "You're our hero, Buddy," she said softly, scratching behind his ears. Ethan reached out, his tiny fingers grasping Buddy's fur. The dog wagged his tail, his eyes filled with quiet contentment. Grace looked out at the village, where the lights in the windows flickered warmly against the night sky. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Buddy by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. Buddy's courage had once again saved Grace and Ethan, solidifying his place as their protector and hero. But his actions also began to change the hearts of the villagers, planting the seeds of understanding and acceptance. The weeks following Samuel's arrest brought a rare period of calm to Grace's life. Ethan grew stronger, his laughter filling the house, and Buddy continued his vigilant watch over the little boy. Though the village had begun to soften its stance, Grace knew that peace was always fragile. Buddy, however, seemed to sense that his job was not yet done. Winter came swiftly, blanketing the village in snow. One evening, as Grace tucked Ethan into bed, she noticed Buddy moving slower than usual. His steps were deliberate, his body heavier than before. "Are you all right, boy?" she asked, kneeling to check on him. Buddy wagged his tail but didn't meet her gaze. Grace's chest tightened with worry. Buddy had been her rock, her constant source of strength, and she couldn't imagine life without him. One crisp morning, Grace decided to take Ethan outside to play in the fresh snow. She bundled him up in a thick coat and scarf, and the three of them ventured into the yard. Ethan's giggles echoed as he toddled through the snow, with Buddy close behind. Grace watched from the porch, a warm cup of tea in her hands. Suddenly, Buddy stopped, his body rigid. He growled low and deep, his eyes fixed on the edge of the forest. Grace followed his gaze and froze. Emerging from the trees was a pack of coyotes, their eyes gleaming with hunger. "Ethan, come here," Grace shouted, panic rising in her chest. But before Ethan could move, the coyotes charged. Buddy didn't hesitate. With a fierce bark, he leapt between Ethan and the oncoming pack, his body a shield for the boy. "Buddy, no!" Grace screamed, running toward them. The scene unfolded in chaotic blurs. Buddy lunging at one coyote, his teeth sinking into its neck, while two others circled him. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, snarling and snapping as he drove the predators away from Ethan. Grace reached Ethan and scooped him into her arms, retreating to the porch. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice shaking. She turned back to the yard just as Buddy delivered a final blow to the largest coyote, sending it yelping back into the woods. The rest of the pack scattered, their hunger no match for Buddy's ferocity. But Buddy stood trembling, blood staining the snow beneath him. He limped toward Grace, his movements slow and labored. Grace dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she held Buddy's head in her hands. "You did it, Buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved him. You saved all of us." Buddy looked up at her, his eyes filled with the same quiet determination that had always defined him. His tail thumped weakly against the ground, as if to say, "It was worth it." Ethan reached out, his tiny hands brushing Buddy's fur. "Buddy," he murmured, his voice soft and full of love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Buddy let out a soft sigh and closed his eyes for the last time. News of Buddy's sacrifice spread quickly, and the village came together to honor him. Even Thomas Hargrove, who had once been Buddy's harshest critic, stood in the village square, his head bowed in respect. "We were wrong," Thomas said, addressing the gathered crowd. "That dog taught us more about loyalty and courage than most of us will learn in a lifetime." The villagers erected a small memorial near Grace's home, a stone engraved with the words, "Buddy, a loyal protector, a true hero." In the weeks that followed, Grace struggled with the loss of Buddy. The house felt emptier without him, and Ethan often pointed to Buddy's favorite spot by the fire, asking, "Where's Buddy?" Grace would smile sadly and say, "He's watching over us from heaven, sweetheart." But as time passed, Grace found comfort in the legacy Buddy had left behind. Ethan continued to grow into a kind and courageous boy. Traits Grace knew were inspired by Buddy's love and protection. The days after Buddy's passing were marked by an aching stillness in Grace's home. The spot near the fireplace, where Buddy had always laid his head, remained empty, a quiet reminder of the loss that lingered in the hearts of Grace and Ethan. Yet, amidst the sorrow, life moved forward. One frosty morning, the village gathered for a ceremony to unveil the memorial for Buddy. The small stone monument stood in a clearing near Grace's home, engraved with the words, "Buddy, a loyal protector, a true hero. Your courage lives on in our hearts." Grace held Ethan in her arms as she stood in front of the crowd. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was family. He taught us about loyalty, love, and what it means to protect those who can't protect themselves. He gave us everything he had, and for that, we'll always be grateful." The villagers, once divided by fear and suspicion, now stood united in their admiration for Buddy. Even Thomas Hargrove stepped forward, placing a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the memorial. "He taught us all something important," Thomas said gruffly, his eyes moist. "We owe him more than we can ever repay." Back at home, Grace and Ethan found solace in small milestones. One sunny afternoon, as Grace sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Ethan toddled onto the grass. For weeks, he had been trying to walk on his own, and now, with careful determination, he took his first wobbly steps. "Ethan," Grace called, her heart swelling with pride. She rushed to him, scooping him into her arms. Ethan giggled, pointing toward the memorial visible in the distance. "Buddy," he said softly, his tiny voice filled with love. Grace held him close, tears pricking her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, Buddy's watching over you." One evening, Margaret Anderson arrived at Grace's door with a small bundle in her arms. "I thought you might need this," she said, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. Grace unwrapped the bundle to reveal a tiny Labrador puppy, its eyes wide and curious. "I know he'll never replace Buddy," Margaret said gently, "but maybe he can help fill the empty space in your hearts." Ethan's face lit up as he reached for the puppy, who wagged its tail enthusiastically. "Buddy?" Ethan asked, looking up at Grace. Grace smiled softly. "Not Buddy, sweetheart, but we'll find a name for him." The puppy, sensing the love in the room, licked Ethan's cheek, making the boy squeal with laughter. The arrival of the puppy brought new energy to Grace's home, though the ache of losing Buddy remained. The little dog reminded them of the joy and hope that life still had to offer. Grace named the puppy Max, and just like Buddy, he became Ethan's constant companion. Together, they explored the yard, played in the snow, and found new ways to make Grace laugh. Though Max was young and untested, Grace saw glimmers of the same protective spirit that had defined Buddy. One day, Grace received an unexpected letter. It was from Lily, Ethan's biological mother, who had disappeared after Samuel's arrest. In the letter, Lily expressed her gratitude for Grace's courage and love. "You've given Ethan a life I could never provide," she wrote. "I hope one day he'll understand how lucky he is to have you and to have had Buddy." Grace folded the letter carefully, her heart heavy with both sadness and relief. She tucked it away in a drawer, knowing it would be something Ethan would want to read when he was older. As winter melted into spring, the village began to change. Inspired by Buddy's legacy, the villagers started to embrace kindness and compassion. They organized events to help abandoned animals and even set up a small shelter near the town square. Thomas Hargrove, once Buddy's harshest critic, became one of the shelter's most active supporters. "If a dog can teach us how to be better humans, he often said. Then the least we can do is honor that lesson. One evening, Grace and Ethan walked to the memorial. Max trotted beside them, his young legs full of energy. As the sun set, casting golden light over the stone, Grace knelt and placed a small bouquet of flowers at its base. "Thank you, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Ethan toddled forward, his tiny hand resting on the cold stone. "Buddy," he said softly, his lips curling into a smile. Max sat quietly beside them, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Buddy's farewell marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Though he was gone, his memory lived on in the hearts of Grace, Ethan, and the entire village. His sacrifice had not only saved a family but also united a community, leaving behind a legacy of love, loyalty, and hope. Years passed, and the village thrived in the shadow of Buddy's legacy. What had once been a community divided by fear and suspicion had transformed into a place of compassion and unity. Though Buddy was gone, his story became a part of the village's identity, retold in hushed tones and warm smiles. Ethan, now a teenager, often visited Buddy's memorial. Though he was too young to remember all the details, Grace had shared countless stories of the dog who had saved his life and shaped their family. One summer evening, Ethan sat on the grass near the stone, Max lying at his feet. "You know, Max," he said, stroking the dog's fur, "Buddy was a hero. Mom says I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." Max wagged his tail, his amber eyes watching Ethan closely. "I hope I can make him proud," Ethan whispered, his gaze fixed on the engraved words. Grace, now older but still full of warmth and strength, often found herself reflecting on how much Buddy had changed her life. She sat on the porch one evening, flipping through a worn photo album filled with pictures of Ethan as a baby, Buddy lying protectively nearby. "Without you, Buddy," she murmured, "none of this would have been possible." Though tears pricked her eyes, they were tears of gratitude. She had found purpose, love, and strength in the dog who had entered her life on that snowy day so many years ago. As Ethan neared adulthood, he announced his plans to study veterinary medicine. "I want to help animals the way Buddy helped us," he told Grace one evening at dinner. Grace's heart swelled with pride. "He'd be so proud of you," she said, placing a hand on Ethan's. "I hope so," Ethan replied, smiling softly. "I want to make sure no animal is ever left behind like he was." The villagers decided to honor Buddy's memory by holding an annual Heroes' Day celebration. Every spring, they gathered near the memorial to share stories of bravery and kindness, both human and animal. Thomas Hargrove, now retired from his role as village elder, often gave the opening speech. "Buddy reminded us of what it means to stand together," he said during one such gathering. "His legacy isn't just about what he did for Grace and Ethan. It's about what he taught all of us." Years later, Ethan returned to the village as a young veterinarian. On his first day back, he visited the memorial with Grace and Max, now an older dog but still full of life. Placing his hand on the stone, Ethan whispered, "Thank you, Buddy, for saving me, for saving Mom, and for showing us what love looks like." Grace stood beside him, her eyes glistening with tears. "He'd be so proud of you," she said softly. Max barked once, as if in agreement, and the three of them stood in silence, letting the moment wash over them. Ethan's work as a veterinarian inspired others in the village to see animals in a new light. The small shelter that had started near the town square grew into a bustling sanctuary, welcoming animals from all over the region. Grace, though no longer as active as she once was, often visited the shelter with baked goods for the staff. She loved seeing the joy on children's faces as they played with the animals, knowing that Buddy's legacy was touching lives far beyond their little village. One crisp autumn evening, Ethan sat on the porch of the family home with Max at his feet. A young puppy, a gift from a grateful family whose pet Ethan had saved, bounded across the yard. Ethan smiled, watching the puppy's playful antics. He glanced toward the horizon, where the fading light painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. "We're doing all right, buddy," he said quietly, his voice filled with peace. "We're doing all right." The wind rustled the leaves gently, as if carrying Buddy's spirit through the air. Ethan leaned back in his chair, Max resting his head on Ethan's knee, and the puppy curling up beside them. A new beginning rooted in a timeless legacy.